Perfect. Hello everybody, my name is Tupper and I am here to give you a panel on where'd my frames go. This is a beginner's guide to avatar optimization, but more importantly, why it matters. So I'm going to have a panel presentation kind of thing. I have a bunch of slides here, a bit of discussion and QA at the end if we have any time. I've timed this out to about 40 minutes. We'll see how I do. So anyways, why is there an anime girl here? Well, first off, I snuck in because I can, and also I was invited here, so I guess that answers that. My name is Tupper. I work for VRChat as the head of community, but that's not important here. Previously, before I worked for VRChat, I did a lot of tutorial videos on avatars. I joined VRChat in 2017 and discovered very quickly there's no tutorial videos. There's nothing there for people to learn how to make avatars. So I learned how to make avatars badly, and then later on, as I talked to more people and understood, hey, why is 256 dynamic bone transforms a bad thing? I learned and picked more of that over time. Yeah, so this is a basically amalgamation, of knowledge I have picked up from lots of people, trying things out, experimenting, and seeing what the results are. Let's move on here. Why should you listen to me? Which is an excellent question. I can attach the Unity profiler to VRChat without getting banned by EAC. So that's a really good reason. But reality, as I said, have a lot of experience just kind of compiling information and doing this research on avatars, figuring out what works well for VRChat. This isn't necessarily the same thing as Unity. VRChat does have a lot of unique systems and things built into it that don't exactly mesh up with what you might expect from a game dev's perspective. So a lot of experimentation, is necessary. A lot of examination of tools that I've done over time has really paid off because now I can see what works well. And also, I used to do VRChat support. So when I started at VRChat, I was answering emails, doing tech support. And you'd be surprised, a lot of people just email in saying, hey, I need to fix my avatar. Can you help me? And I did. I don't think they do that anymore. It turned out to be a little bit too resource intensive, but I learned a lot just from working through that. And finally, part of my job is keeping up with all of you are doing. All of you do all kinds of crazy stuff with worlds and avatars and events like this one. And part of my job is to keep up with what the heck you're doing and how the heck you're doing it so that we can adapt to it and make sure that we make it better for you to do. So anyways, one more thing that is important. I'm not a Unity engineer by trade. I guess by training, I have a physics degree and I did data science, so I know R and Python, that's about it. So anyways, I can be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's totally fine. I'm wrong all the time. I want you to correct me. So another thing that's important here also is some things in this presentation may be kind of simplified to the point of feeling like it's wrong. It's not, I promise you. Part of teaching is simplifying out the complexities until someone figures out the big picture before they noodle down to the tiny things. So let's move on. Where did your frames go? There are a couple different sources of frame rate lag in VRChat. The first one is application, and you can't do anything about that. That is on us. Notably, we've gotten a bit better at that over time. There's some things we can do to improve, and we are literally everything that we do at this point has some kind of application performance factor built into it. But yeah, don't worry about that part. You can't do anything about it. Worlds is a different story. There's a bunch of things like Udon, shaders, textures, whatever. Just go watch Wishstream's panel from yesterday. In addition to all the excellent design advice, they also covered a bunch of optimization things. And finally, there is avatars, which is what we're talking about here. Lots of different systems. Most importantly, avatars are portable. Avatars can go anywhere. They will appear in any world, and there can be tons of them. Not just 80, but for reasons we'll get to later, it could be over 80. It could be hundreds. So, yeah. One concept we should demonstrate, or I should talk about before we move on, is frame time. In any VR application, you want to try and aim for 72 to 90 FPS at best, or at worst, depending on the headset. And in VR, if you're trying to get to 90, you have 11 milliseconds, 11.3, I think. That means that if you divide that by 40, so for 40 people in the instance, you only get about 0.27 milliseconds per avatar. That's like no time at all. You also have to do other things. You have to render the world. You have to do Udon. You have to do the networking, all that kind of thing. And yeah, it builds up very rapidly. So keep that in mind as we move forward. And this is a question that I basically had this emoji commission to express my reaction to. Why should I optimize? But that's okay. I'll answer it for you anyways. First off, you've worked hard on your avatar. You want people to see it. You don't want to have someone turn you into a fallback or a gray diamond or whatever. That's like, just, it's not good. It's not a great feeling. You have a bunch of work that you've done on it. You want to show it off. It's also your persona. It's your identity. It's you. So you want people to see you as you, well, wish to be perceived. And of course, more frame rate, always better. And then the final item I have here, which is important, but a lot of people don't really, some people don't care about this, but you should be nice, be kind, don't slow down other people's experiences. It is partially your responsibility to keep VRChat a performant place so people don't, you know, crash out because they loaded your 1.2 gigabyte VRAM avatar. But anyways, you might be saying, hey, but my avatar is for a special purpose. I have a performance or I have a show that I put on. That's fine. But if you're in the middle of like shelter or a club, like Club Thin or just like somewhere where there's tons of people, you don't need every bell and whistle. You don't need to put on a show. You are there to just be you, and you can strip down your avatar to its basics, and you can be good or excellent. Oh, I don't have this built in here, but a lot of people have been surprised that this avatar is good rated. And a lot of people expect me not to have a good rated avatar, which, I don't know. Just thought I'd mention it. Anyways, so I probably convinced you to optimize your avatar, and you're asking where's the step-by-step guide. I'm not going to give you one. I'm not going to give you step-by-step 1, 2, 3 just guides here. They are limiting. What I want to give you is knowledge. I don't want to give you a routine. I want to teach you what the problems are, why they're problems, and how you can address them in a general sense. This means that you can deal with problems as you run into them, instead of just having one rote process that fits to one avatar in one case. Let's move on with a couple of assumptions. I'm going to assume you've messed around with avatar creation a little bit. Maybe you've tried once or twice, that you've tried Unity, Blender, that kind of thing, and of course that you've, you know, spent some time in VRChat. And finally, some categories that we're going to skim through very quickly, or rather that we're going to spend the rest of the panel on. Rendering is where your computer draws the stuff. Memory is where your computer stores the stuff, and computing is where your computer thinks about the stuff, with this high-tech technology on the right side. Let's start with rendering. Rendering is where your processor is telling your graphics card, hey, please do this thing. These things are called calls, and calls can be, there's a bunch of different ones, but we're going to talk about two primarily here. First is a draw call, which is, hey, please draw this on the screen. And the second is a skinning call, which is a little bit more specialized, where the processor asks, hey, take this mesh with these instructions and squish it around in some way. One thing I will recommend very strongly is if you want to dig into like the really deep details on rendering, not just in Unity, but just in general. Simon Schreit's Render Hell, linked right here, is excellent. I pull a couple graphics and things for this panel there, but yeah, just read through it. I still haven't gotten through it. It's quite a lot. But the first thing is draw calls. Again, hey, render this thing is essentially all that it is. It is the CPU saying, please render this to the graphics card. It passes it a mesh, texture, a shader program, and it executes and passes back the result. You're going to have a lot of these, no matter what. Unity can group them into batches depending on a couple of different conditions, but the most important thing here is if you have too many of them, the CPU has to wait a lot. It's sort of parallelized. I didn't pronounce that right, but it can kind of do multiple at once, but not really. Draw calls are, they halt the processing until they are complete. And remember, you only have 11 milliseconds per frame. What uses draw calls? Draw calls come from two primary things: submeshes, which is material slots, as you'll see on the right side if it's not too small. One of my avatars here has 6 materials across the entire mesh that I use in the avatar, which means that mesh has 6 submeshes. Each one of those incurs a draw call, or more accurately, it depends on the shader, because you have shader passes. Shader passes are a draw call, and a pass in a shader is basically saying, hey, go over all of the pixels in this particular part of the drawing instruction and do a thing. Usually most shaders in VRChat are single pass. Not all of them are, but I'll get to that later. As a bonus, I'll talk about grab passes here. They are a way for you to tell the graphics card, hey, please stop, take a screenshot of what's currently rendered and give it back to me so I can do stuff with it. The problem is this takes a while for the graphics card to do, and it stops everything. All rendering stops. They're super expensive. There are ways to make them less expensive. You can share grab pass names, but there's not really a super established standard for this, so it's very possible to have tons of grab passes in a scene. Recommendation here is not to use them, although I know it's kind of attractive to have the cool little, you know, glasses that deform how they look. First mention of a tool I'll have here is Thryralla's Avatar Performance Tools. Thrice tool can count grab passes for you across your shaders. So use that. Oh, excuse me 1 minute. So the general approach to reducing draw calls is just reduce the number of submeshes that you have. That's it. That's all you really need to do. And the way that you can do that, first off, is by reducing your material count. You should aim for less than 10. The medium performance rank is good enough, honestly. I know we call it like excellent, good, medium, poor, very poor. But as long as it's medium or better, you're doing great. You're doing fine. You're doing better than the majority of VRChat avatars. And keep in mind that material slot count is what matters. It is not the number of shared materials. If I had the same material across all 6 of these slots here, it is still 6 submeshes, with an exception. Ooh, I need water. 1 moment. This is tough. Alternately, I might be talking a little bit too fast. So, moving on, atlasing, which is probably one of the first videos I got well known for. I did a kind of guide on how to atlas avatars using Blender, but this is a process that's still useful. Basically, it's combining textures, so you need fewer materials. Say you have like 4 different materials on your avatar, they use a different diffuse. You smash them all together into one map. You do this by merging UVs and then baking the textures together. There's a couple ways to do this. This is mostly on the avatar author, because as soon as you have to do it to an avatar to make it more optimal, you're going to potentially lose some quality and make it harder to work with the model. Atlasing, however, has gotten better lately. There are some tools out there to make this much less painful, in particular UV Packmaster. It's outside of the scope of this panel, but it is essentially a heuristic UV packing system where it takes your graphics card, slams like this problem at it multiple times, and eventually comes out of the problem space with a solution. It's really cool. I would strongly recommend just checking it out if you're looking into atlasing and materials. Next up is joining your mesh. There's a bunch of stats here. I'm going to skim through it. Joining your meshes is just basically if you have multiple meshes on your avatar, you should join them together. Here's why. Here's some benchmarks I lifted from an unrelated but useful test on the VRChat team. They took 100 avatars with 7 skin meshes, and that baseline meant that you had a mesh skinning time of 3.27 milliseconds and camera render of 2.73. So skinning calls took 3.27 and draw calls took 2.7 essentially. So if you join all of those meshes without atlasing, so you have a single mesh but there's 7 materials, all of a sudden you get a ton more time on skinning calls, which we'll talk about later. That's yeah, hold on, I can't read my own thing here. 17% of the previous value, half a millisecond down from 3.27. So that's pretty good. The next case is where you atlas down to 1 material per avatar, but you keep the submeshes. This is actually kind of hard to do as a user, so I wouldn't pay too much attention here. The most important part to notice here is that you have the same number of draw calls, but you still have the submeshes, so we're still paying attention to how much a submesh is affecting things. But if you atlas everything down to 1 material and 1 submesh per avatar, you are now down to 16% of your baseline for your rendering call. So this is a single draw call per mesh. It's a single skinning call per mesh. This is the ideal case. This is why you would want to join meshes together and also merge materials, of course. So next up, we have batching. As a quick aside, I mentioned that Unity can do draw call batching. It's basically putting all of the draw calls into a basket and saying, hey, do all of these at once. These are useful, but in the land of VRChat, they rarely happen. They're mostly useful for when you're building a game and you have complete control of all of the materials and all of the shaders that are being used. The materials have to be really similar. The shader has to be set up for it. And it's not as useful for dynamic things like avatars. It's super useful for worlds and like static scenes. But yeah, I know someone's probably going to mention that, but turns out it's not super useful. I will also mention shader passes. The best way to avoid extra shader passes is just to use well-known shaders. Actually, come to think of it, these shaders are probably more anime aesthetic leaning, so you guys are going to know a little bit better than I am. But VRChat shaders in general minimize extra passes already. The ones I have here, like Poyomi, Lil Toon, Silent, Mochis, are all great. They're all extremely optimized. They all are full of features, and they run very well, so you avoid those multiple passes in most cases on these shaders. Poyomi, I know, in fact, because I use it a lot, can enable multiple passes depending on what feature you have enabled. but yeah, if you keep it at fairly baseline, then you won't run into those. So moving on, some miscellaneous shader stuff, and this is where I'm going to catch some furry hate, I think. Not on the grab passes, which you should just avoid, but on tessellation. Tessellation is often used for fur shaders, and TLDR, it subdivides a mesh at runtime. It's very often used for fur. It's really expensive, especially on AMD due to some shenanigans NVIDIA pulled about 15 years back. There are some good fur shaders out there that don't use tessellation or keep it pretty minimal. But yeah, tessellation can be really expensive, so be careful with it. And then finally, and this is more relevant for Quest, so it's more Quest world since you can't have custom shaders on avatars on Quest. Don't overlap transparent materials. Just don't set large swaths of your avatar to transparent. That's not a fun time. Overdraw is hard, especially for mobile GPUs. Moving on, I've mentioned skinning calls a couple of times. This is where the CPU asks the graphics card, hey, please deform this mesh. It's run across the subset of verts on a mesh that are affected by whatever skinning is done. Each blend shape or bone dispatches a compute shader, and because VRChat uses GPU skinning here. This is important because it's how, well, this happens. It's how moving around your arms and having blend shapes and that kind of stuff happens. This is all done in compute shading on your graphics card. But it can be bad in some cases, specifically in Unity 2019, where blend shapes are really expensive. Apparently having on any blend shapes at all costs more than you expect, and it expands over time. So if you have multiple blend shapes, it's not great. The problem kind of stops in Unity 2021. Saying it stops there isn't quite accurate, but yeah. You can separate out your face mesh to its own skin mesh to kind of reduce the skinning call here. It's mixed on if that's that useful. Probably not useful in Unity 2021. And most importantly, always on blend shapes, like ones that are used to adjust parts of your model to, say, shrink it below close that you turned on, are bad. They're just bad. They are terrible. When you have a blend shape that is on all of the time, every single time you draw that mesh, you have to do a skinning call first. Hey, deform this mesh. Okay, thank you. Okay, it's the next time to do it next frame. Hey, can you deform this exact same mesh in this exact same way again? And then it does it over and over and over. So if you have a blend shape that you always have set to anything other than 0, that means it's on, and you should consider ways to work around that. This is actually a pretty dang big cost lately. But anyways, let's move on to memory, which is one of my favorite parts. But when we're talking about memory, we have two types. Very quick technical lesson here, RAM and VRAM. RAM is your general purpose stuff on your computer. It's pretty fast, and it has a direct line to the CPU, and you usually have a lot. It's pretty cheap. VRAM, on the other hand, is memory that is on your graphics card itself. It is insanely fast. It is usually 2 times faster than the typical RAM. And the most common amount right now is 8 gigabytes, just as the median amount on graphics cards. But you can get as high as 24 with the 4090 or 7900 XTX. So what eats RAM? Basically everything. Everything has to sit resident in RAM because that has to get passed out of your... It gets downloaded from VRChat, it gets passed from the cache on your drive to your memory, and then it sits there. So everything, anything from textures to shaders, mesh data, all that stuff. But VRAM's a little different. Anything that's used specifically to render, as in draw the pixels on the screen, so we lose like audio, obviously. But it's mostly textures, but they can't be compressed here. This is important, we'll get to this later. You can't compress textures. Again, this is where I'm simplifying here, so I'm technically wrong, but you can't say use crunch compression here. When you check on crunch compression, it does not affect VRAM. I actually skipped that in here, so let me do a sidebar here. Turning on crunch does nothing for VRAM at all. It does absolutely nothing. Do not expect turning on crunch to affect your VRAM stat. In fact, you are spending a little bit more time to decompress and put that into VRAM from RAM. It's minuscule because crunch is a very fast algorithm, but either way, it's good to keep in mind. Mesh data, obviously, as well, and shaders are tiny at this point because you're really only passing in one set of instructions, so they're irrelevant. Most importantly, memory is a limited resource. Unlike frame rate, when we were talking about rendering, if you run out of frame time, you just lower your FPS. You're not at 90 anymore. If you run out of memory, bad stuff happens. If you're out of VRAM, you start swapping to RAM. If you start running out of RAM, you start swapping to mass storage, or you just crash. If the Quest runs out of memory, it just falls over and dies. It has no alternative because the Quest only has just system memory. There is no VRAM. So anyways, this is pretty obvious, but or at least to me, it's a question I get a lot. But like, what's the biggest problem with avatars right now? Not just with memory, but with everything. It's texture size. That is it. There's not much else that really we're having problems with right now. And that we're seeing. It's why we added the VRAM stat. Download size isn't really representative of how people have done with their texture compression on their avatars. So yeah, it's just textures. And you don't need 13 different AK avatars, or 13 AK textures in your avatar. You do not. There are ways to work around it, and let's talk about it a little bit. So first off, textures have resolution. It's just like a picture. It's like 256 by 256 or 2K or 4K or whatever. Anytime that you take a texture and you go up by a power of 2, so from 1K to 2K, you're actually eating up 4 times more memory. Not 2 times, 4 times. And here's how you can kind of visualize it. 4 1K textures can fit into 1 2K. It didn't really show up on the screen here very well, but those 4 little boxes fit into the one big box. Textures sit in RAM and are passed to VRAM, and sometimes, and they'll sit resident in VRAM for a bit. We do clear these after a world change or 5 minutes after you last saw that avatar. So it does eventually clear out. So like mesh problems, sorry, I'm getting off track a little bit. Like mesh problems, there we go. There's a very simple solution here. All you need to do to reduce texture memory usage is reduce its size. All you have to do is just drop it down. 4Ks are almost never actually required. 8Ks never are, just never touch 8K. 4Ks you should avoid, and 2K is the kind of ideal target here. You should be doing this resizing in Unity, by the way, so you're not destructively editing your textures. So just like pull down the little Dropbox you have here and pull it down to 2K. And another important thing here is you should not be shoving your camera into your avatar when you're judging how the changing quality affects your avatar. You should have a camera back about a meter away from your avatar in Unity, and once you start to see degradation from that point of view, then you should start assuming that you need to go a little bit higher with the texture resolution, or do some of these other steps here. It's having someone look at your avatar very closely, although it does occur, is a more rare occurrence than someone just seeing your avatar in passing. And it's important to keep that in mind when you are designing your avatar and how you have your textures set up. So one of the best ways that I've been using lately to find texture issues with size and even with compression types is to use Thry's tools. Furality has this excellent tool. You just install it. It's I think there's even a VCC thing that you can install now, so you just plug in the URL and it gets installed in the project. It will tell you what the current size of the texture is. It will tell you the current resolution and compression settings, and will even recommend downsizing the texture. So it'll say, hey, this is 4K, you could drop it to 2K. Or it'll even tell you better compression methods that may reduce the amount of VRAM usage or even provide some other optimizations. Just in the process of making this presentation, I was able to shave off like 15 megs off of my avatar just accidentally. So thanks, Thry. Moving on, there's also normal maps. This is a common offender. Normal maps are really important, but they don't need to be huge, massive. There's this idea called a detail normal, where if you have something that's really tiled, like for example, the cloth right here, that's right on my avatar, this cloth has a little bit of a really fine, like almost, I don't know what to call it, like it's a cloth texture, whatever, it's a cloth normal. I didn't do this by painting the normal directly onto all parts of the diffuse. I made a mask and then tiled this tiny little 256 by 256 tile of normals, and that's what I'm using here. There's also some other features available in shaders, like stochastic sampling, which allows random textures to keep looking random. You don't have to have that weird tiling artifacting there. So moving on, we also have masks. Masks don't have to be huge. They can be tiny. They can be 512 and still work great. Experiment with it. Just kind of look in the area where you have a division on the masks and figure out where your cutoff point is for your resolution. And diffuse, obviously. I've heard a lot, like, if I down-res my diffuse texture, my tattoo gets fuzzy. This is a deeper topic, but it goes into the next thing, which is bad UV mapping. This is really hard to really fix, and it is a very common problem. I mentioned it before kind of with the texture atlasing stuff. If your avatar has bad UV mapping, you're wasting a ton of texture space. So you could have the most amazing texture and the most amazing model, but if all of your UVs are shoved up into a corner or you've got a bunch of space that's unutilized, you're just burning memory. It's doing nothing. Those pixels are still in the video card, and they do absolutely nothing. So you can do some clever things to avoid this. Obviously, you can make better UVs, but with that aside, you can also do things like decals and detailed textures. As you can see on this model here, which is kind of like my public hangaround avatar, shoutouts Troyan, there is this little barcode that has a little VRChat logo on it. It is itsy bitsy on the avatar, but it is part of a higher resolution detail mask that I think is like, I don't know, a megabyte, but it's super clear on the diffuse because it's using the, I think that's using detail textures in particular. So you don't have to have super huge UV or super huge resolutions for your diffuse. A couple of final notes on textures. Using shaders and textures cleverly, especially masks, lets you do some absolutely crazy stuff in tiny spaces. You don't have to use a huge amount of memory for these things. It's all about knowing what features you have to play with and knowing how to use those textures effectively without wasting space. And remember that each pixel is 4 bits of data, not bits, bytes, whatever. That's not what I mean. It's the casual sense of bits. You have 0 to 256 4 times. That's a lot of data, and you have tons of pixels of that. You should not be wasting it. So I actually had some more notes that I wanted to squeeze in. The most powerful tool that you have is shaders. Learn to use and abuse the absolute shit out of these things. You should use the color ID maps, decals, detail normals, global masks. It allows you to squeeze in so much into your avatar without affecting other people's performance nearly as much. Again, this avatar is good rated. All of my avatars, well, that one's medium, but that's okay. That's Fizzbone's components. All of my avatars are either good or medium, and people are always surprised when I show that off. It doesn't take that long to learn those particular skills, but it does take time. It takes a non-zero amount. Another thing that you can do to reduce memory usage is mesh data. Blendshapes are the big offender here. You really should just remove any blend shapes you're not using, and tools like VRC can do this automatically. Mesh normals are another thing here. The SDK tries to save you here. Just listen to the SDK. Please don't ignore it. It's trying to help you. And as a very big side note here, VRC Fury is an amazing tool built by Senki. It's really, really cool. You can use it to non-destructively build things onto your avatar and make edits at build time. So if you decide you don't do a thing that you just did, you just remove the step, and it never happens. It doesn't happen during build. Please try it out. Please give it a shot, even if it's just for the blend shape tool here. The blend shape tool is amazing. Senki, you might be out there somewhere in Furality watching, so hello, Senki. You're cool. Moving on, audio files is another big usage. There's a bunch of details here that I'm kind of going to skip. Really just don't use long audio files. No one wants to hear your 2-minute long intro song. I'm really sorry. We just don't. But if you must have avatar or audio on your avatar, use load in background. There's also some more stuff to read into in Unity docs regarding how it compresses and decompresses at runtime. Check that out if you're interested. So let's move on to the final section, which is computing. And this is a direct screenshot from my notes when I was writing up the outline here regarding animators, because animators are insane. They are complete, Turing complete state machines. People use them to build game logic for their own Unity games, and you can build your own for your avatar. You have complete control over it. We even provide you with some state behaviors on how to do crazy stuff and affect the animator in ways that normally you'd have to script. You go watch Echo Sangin's panel from yesterday on Avatars 3. I think it was yesterday, but it's very good. It's really deep. I'm going to try and cover animators very light touch here, just the major big things that people should be avoiding. First off, you should realize that animators are programs. Since it's very possible to make a poorly performing program, it's also possible to make a very poorly performing animator. Another important part is that, seriously, go watch Echo Sangin's panel, but also animators are a black box. We don't know how they're executed. You guys don't have Unity source. You have no idea how the code is, you don't know how to best use the system in order to prevent issues with it. There are some tips if you dig around, especially from around the 2010, 2012 kind of era when Mechanim Dev was implementing the animator system. If you poke around the Unity forums, you can find some interesting information. And Unity Docs has some, they're thin. As usual, Unity documentation is thin on the subject. The first tip is very easy. Just use one animator. I assumed kind of during this that it would be a duh thing, but I looked through a couple of avatars just randomly, and people do actually use more than one animator sometimes. You never need to do that. More than one animator is always redundant, with the slight note I have here. One animator can do the work of many, 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 many others, and per Mechanim Dev, one animator animating 1,000 properties is faster than 1,000 animating one each. So please, like, you should, for the level that this panel is delivered, you should never be using more than one animator, honestly. If you are, then you're doing something that's outside the scope of, like, this kind of level of technical talk. Moving on, there's also minimizing layer count. This one's straightforward. I mistyped something here, but basically the number of layers that you have, if you increase that, your performance proportionally gets worse. Every animator clip or animation clip and layer that you add also adds a little bit of memory usage. There's not really many numbers here. Again, I'm gleaning from a lot of information I've dug into forum posts by the guy who made this, but you just should keep it as low as you can. Thrice tool also, it's kind of faded out here because my play mode color is like this green color, but Thrice tool will tell you how many layers that you have. They have some numbers there. I'm just going to go ahead and assume that Thrive has done a little bit of benchmarking and that their indicators for what's good and what's bad is good. They might be wrong. I don't know. Thrive's usually right, though. They're smart. Next up, setting weight to 0 on unused animators or animator layers. If you have an animator layer and it's set to 0 weight, it never gets called in the update step for the animator, so it just doesn't run because it doesn't need to. Its weight is 0. So if you're not using a layer in your animator, please set its weight to 0 using the animator layer controller state behavior. You will have to do this in another layer. This is kind of a smaller tip. It only really applies if you're handcrafting your own animators. But yeah, so next up on compute is constraints. We thought constraints were cheap like free, and they're not. And it's for a very silly reason. TCL helped me out a lot with this. TCL actually helped me out with a lot of this, so shout outs TCL. But constraint execution is multi-threaded. Like when you have constraints on your avatar, they're executed in parallel. But there's a prerequisite step that runs every frame where it sorts by the hierarchy in the entire scene. So it doesn't matter that they're that they're multi-threaded, because you still have to wait on a single serial process to complete. We have a dev update that talks about this back in February on the 16th. Please go read it. Also, shout outs to VRC Red that provided that graph there that shows basically the flat line there is Fizzbones, which I'll talk about in a bit, and that line that just keeps going up linearly is constraints. But it doesn't go up linearly forever. It has this big performance cliff at 683, I think, that once you get past that point, the sorting takes so long that it like it's some kind of weird internal Unity thing. This is what kind of caught our attention because we saw some like clone prefabs that use thousands of constraints. Please don't use those. They are, sure, they're cool, but they're terrible. Use them in your own instance for recording or whatever you're doing. But yeah, you should really only be using about 15 constraints per avatar is what I'm getting at here. Once you get to about 600, 1/5 of your frame budget is being spent on constraints, which is nutty. This doesn't really... It might get better in next Unity versions. Again, I asked TCL, who's one of the people working on our Unity version upgrade, to check this out. Inconclusive if constraints get better, so just be careful. On the other hand, Fizzbones are super optimized. Comparing them against Bones is not even remotely fair. If you just stick with our performance rank numbers, though, you'll do fine. Those numbers were formed as part of our benchmarking progress here, or benchmarking process when we were developing Fizzbones. Big shout out for Kiro. Kiro is the engineer that developed Fizzbones. There were a couple people that worked on it, but it was primarily Kiro, and they did like magic work. And it utilizes, if you're a little bit more technically inclined, it utilizes Unity dots, which is just a different processing technique. We want to do more things with it because it lets us do things like this in parallel. Contacts are also the same thing. The VRChat contacts are pretty dang optimized, but they do have limits. We do have limits that are built in and are recommended. There are cases where if you use a ton of them, you can cause issues. We're working on these, but it may involve implementing hard limits. This is kind of your special developer at a panel sneak peek. The contacts, once you hit a huge amount, actually can like cause serious problems with VRChat. So probably going to have a very high up there, but still hard cap on contacts at some point in the future. Next up, Unity Cloth. I've had people ask me about this. The advice is very simple. Don't. It's not really good. It has tons of bugs in 2019, apparently. And we eventually just want to make our own VRChat Fizz Cloth, which is something that we've got this like itch for, but who knows if/when we'll get to it. Development is hard. And physics objects. Again, it's just kind of a don't thing. They do break a lot. They interact with our VRChat inherent systems quite a bit. I can't play GIFs in this, obviously, but like just imagine like the Gmod object stuck in a wall kind of thing, and that's what usually happens with the physics objects. Of course, for like flight colliders and stuff like that, at least until that breaks or has to get broken. I'm not going to talk about that anymore. Anyways, use Fizzbones instead where you can. I think that might be kind of it. I went faster than I expected, so I apologize if I rushed through things. I was a little nervous that I'd put too much in here. Hopefully you understand that the point of this panel was to teach you that knowledge is the important thing here, not process. Once you understand what's broken and what you need to pay attention to in the SDK, it's easier to fix these things because you see where the problem comes from. If I had to pick three, though, out of all the things I've talked about today for people to focus on, it is textures, number one, and then a huge gap, and then animators and draw call reduction. Textures are rough nowadays. Before I finish things up completely, though, one more thing I didn't cover here are polygons, and there's a reason for that. Polygons are really kind of a secondary effect of the other things I've talked about. Draw calls and skinning calls in particular their speed is a parameter of how many vertices you have on your avatar. They're a function of the number of vertices you have in your avatar. So the more you have, the more those cost. So a lot of people say that polygons don't affect performance or things along those lines. That's just wrong. There are cases where polygons can absolutely cause lots of problems, especially when it comes to things like multiple shader passes or skinning, stuff like that. Blendshapes especially. Generally, just keep polygons as low as you can. I know our limits can feel, well, limiting, but they're there for a reason. But anyways, I think, I wanted to give some thanks to people out there, in particular Furality and the Furality team for inviting me and also for running Furality. I've been watching you guys from the start. If you'll forgive my slight bit of vulgarity, you guys are fucking nuts. This is crazy. I've gone to Furality before and run around, but it's insane that the coordination that the team puts together, the worlds that they've worked on, it's great. It's easily the smoothest running event that we have in VRChat, just bar none. TCL and Kiro, as well as a few other members of the VRChat team for helping to fact check me just in general and also for this. Also, of course, every VRChat creator, everyone who creates worlds, avatars, Udon, shaders, tools, prefabs, whatever. All of you are amazing. Please keep doing what you can until we get creator economy out, and then we'll start getting some money for you. And then, of course, finally, thank you to every kind-hearted VR chatter out there. You in particular, and you know who you are why people love this place and why people come here and they find friends and they find family. The internet can be kind of a rough place sometimes, but you are the reason that people stick around. So yeah, I think that's it. I'm done. I got 12 minutes left. Thank you. Yeah. Hello, Firon.
I have questions from the community for you.
Oh boy. Okay, let's do it. Where should I stand? I'm gonna stay on my short box.
Stay on your box. You know that way we can meet eye to eye.
I see.
Let's see. I have one question here from a name that I can't quite pronounce, but they ask, what's the largest avatar you've ever had to optimize?
Ooh, see, the word largest is interesting. So, person that Firon can't pronounce the name of, the largest avatar is... So file size is one thing, right? File size isn't exactly the main thing that you're aiming for here, but a lot of people like doing that because they don't want to, have huge avatars. VRAM is really the big thing that I've been paying attention to lately. I have worked on avatars that have upwards of 1.2 to 1.4 gigabytes. That's 1,400 megabytes of VRAM usage. And it is almost always in just absurd usage of 8K textures, just complete ignorance of shader features, things that are done on top of each other, redundant things. Those are tough, mostly because those usually come as part of something that's like there's not much regard for performance in general. So there's just, yeah, sure, like the air filters out, but then the rest of the car is on fire. That kind of thing. So those can be tough, but that's probably the answer there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I've got another question here from Manu8. They're asking, what are good fur shaders without tessellation?
Oh, you guys are going to know better than me. I don't have any fur on me yet. There is, I know excess fur, like that was the last time I really looked into one that was like heavily optimized. Shishi has done excellent work on that. I think there's a couple more out there. But this is an exercise left to the reader a little bit, unfortunately. I don't have much knowledge in this direction. I'll start to gain it, I'm sure, as soon as people watch this panel and say, hey, I know this shader, and then can poke through it and see that.
Fair enough.
But what you're looking for, again, is avoiding tessellation. Like, tessellation is, it looks cool, but it is really heavy on performance. And as previously noted, AMD cards just aren't good at it, because NVIDIA was kind of, man, I love my NVIDIA cards, but they were dickheads 15 years ago. Like, they screwed over AMD pretty bad.
Let's see. I have another question here from Chalet Dragon asking, why does VRC currently use an older version of Unity?
Oh, that one's easy, because upgrading Unity is hard. There's a lot of problems, and thankfully, actually, I have some interesting stuff I can go through on this. Like, upgrading, when we upgraded Unity in the past, we've always had these kind of caveats of like, oh, well, we've upgraded, but oh shit, all this stuff broke, right? It's usually shaders. Those things aren't portable between Unity versions, even though Unity says they are. So at some point, we went to Unity and said, hey, don't you guys guarantee that these bundles work between versions? And they're like, yeah. And they were like, well, they don't. And they're like, oh, so we have been upgrading to Unity 2021 and potentially even farther versions internally, and that's been going really well. We've been working with Unity on that. We have a closed beta going right now. I actually would be running that closed beta right now if I wasn't afraid of breaking the systems here. But it works pretty dang well, so that's probably coming soon. TLDR, it's hard. It's really hard. We don't want to break your stuff. That's the last thing we want to do. We don't want to make people upload.
I think we definitely appreciate that.
Yeah.
Let's see. Have a question here from Rainwolf asking, out of curiosity, could the slides from the panel be shared more immediately, as it would be very helpful information to share more immediately?
Yeah, sure. Also, hi, Rain. Yeah, I can put them up. I'll convert them over to like a Google Drive or something. And I got to use PowerPoint for the first time in 6 years. Hooray! So yeah, I'll do that.
I've got another question here from Atlas. What about avatar mesh compression? Does that help at all?
I don't know enough about this. Meshes aren't too bad. Like, if you follow our default settings that the SDK urges you to go with, like turning off legacy blend shape normals, you avoid a lot of the problems with mesh size. So that kind of helps the most. I don't know that much about mesh compression in the current versions of Unity. Don't have an answer for you. I can do more research into it, though. Like, textures are still the biggest thing. Like, I didn't really cover it here, but textures are almost always, like, way bigger than the mesh that's being used up in VRAM. We don't even list it, actually, in the stats. That's just textures. There's no mesh information included in that. That's how big of a difference it is.
Good to know. Let's see. Got another question here from Aramel. How many particles to be optimized?
I mean, I could be a jerk and say 0 because that is the correct answer. I mean, the performance rank system has decent limits on there, but they're pretty harsh on things like mesh particles, because those are, you have unknown values there. Like, we can't dig super deep into how the particle system reacts in certain ways, because it's non-deterministic behavior. So it could act differently in different ways. Particles are rough. The Unity particle system is a little bit crusty. I think they replace it with the FX graph, or they don't replace it. Like, that's meant to be the replacement in future pipelines. But follow the numbers on the performance ranks as best you can. Again, if you're doing something for like a show or performance, like, go wild, but just don't wear that in situations where there's lots of people. The answer is 0.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much. Now you know. Another question here from Rekia Sharp. Does using the same texture file in multiple places affect performance in the same way that using the same material multiple times can cause more draw calls?
So I'm not sure if this is shader dependent or if Unity is smart enough to like reference the same thing over and over. I'm 90% sure that if you use the same texture in multiple places, it optimizes that out for you. I may be incorrect. This may depend on actually how the shader is implemented. Ideally, what you actually want to do, and I didn't cover this, I kind of wish I could have edited a little bit later on as well. Oh, my foot's gone. But texture packing, like packing your textures into multiple channels is super important. Is my tracker back on? It sure is. Oh, there we go. I'm back. Classic. Taking your, like things like ambient occlusion, things like smoothness, roughness, those are just one channel of data, right? Like you don't need RGBA. So a lot of shaders like Poyomi, and I'm sure all of them do, it's just the one I had the most experience with, allow you to pack multiple things into one channel, which is like, or in multiple textures into one texture. So your ambient occlusion is one channel, your metallic is another channel. It's all just one image. So the answer to your question directly is, yes, probably. I'm fairly sure it optimizes it out, but you really should be looking at like channel packing techniques, so you can use masks, multiple masks in one image. I mean, that's a 4 times memory. Like you'll use a quarter as much memory if you fully pack that texture.
Excellent. That's like you said, 4 pixels of data, right?
Yep.
I've got one more question here. Let's see, from Cyber Kitsune. Will there be a better way to profile avatars and animators in the future? And will animator metrics ever be added to performance ranks?
Ooh, this is a good question. So let's go back in history a little bit and let's talk about Second Life. Second Life has this very obtuse performance system. It's a performance score that's just, I don't have a huge amount of knowledge on it, so I'm smoothing it the hell out. But it's just a number. It's calculated in some way based off of a bunch of things that are rather opaque. And unfortunately, if we had to do a system, like that's kind of the main approach. Like you either have the really technical dig down one or you have the vast score, because if you have both systems, like you have to make sure that they match up, and there could be some weird social things like where someone says, oh, well, my score is this, but yeah, you're still using enough textures to blow out a 4090. There's obviously some nuances here that could probably be worked out, and I am very much like glossing over the problem, but an aggregate score encourages incorrect behavior, maybe is what I'm kind of going for. It's better to understand where each one of these pieces are together and be able to optimize them into a place where you are, on the whole, just like your avatar behaves better. That being said, like more tools, I think, is your question, and the answer to that is very yes. Like, hell yeah, I want more tools. The one about animators in particular, I just want to bring up like my oh god slide again, because like profiling animators, okay, so when you build an avatar, it turns into an asset bundle, it gets shoved onto the servers and it gets downloaded and it gets extracted and run, right? But when I receive your animator, my computer doesn't see like the layers and stuff like that. I don't get that. I get this just compiled program. It's actually literally is a compiled program that is the animator. You can't tear it apart. You get very little insight into what's happening. You can see, I think, like what layers currently being used, what states currently being whatever, but you can't profile it. Like that data just doesn't exist. There are no hooks for it. And if there is, then we have to like enable debugging mode in VRChat. And allow people to attach profilers, which is, first off, as I said, like really spooky when it comes to anti-tamper, and second off, is going to murder performance on its own. We do have a bunch of things that we've done and we've talked to Unity about that are related to this. Nothing really concrete, but yeah, animators are a challenge. We've even talked about systems eternally. It's like, what if we just say, screw animators? What if we just do our own thing? Turns out it's hard, but not that hard. Preview.
I've got
maybe
one more little short question here.
Sure.
If you happen to know, how bad or good are bones in terms of performance?
So bones are basically they're part of skinning calls, and if it depends entirely on how many verts are skinned to that bone. So if you have a bone that's only skinned to like 20 verts, like for example, these guys here are pretty low polygon. And they don't deform, they just kind of wiggle, although I think it's still done in the skinning step when these move around. That's not so bad. It's when you move a large amount of vertices, it's like directly proportional with the number of verts. But also the number of bones affects this. This is digging a little bit into areas I don't know, so I am making some pretty heavy assumptions and suppositions here, so I'm probably wrong in some cases. But like skinning calls generally are affected by the number of verts there. And they also, of course, depend on how many bones that you have overall. If you have a ton of bones, like you're going to see frame loss for whatever reason. There's a bunch of factors involved. So sorry, that's not really a very good answer, but generally keep number low.
Still appreciate the insight.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it.
I think that's it for our time. Any last words?
Awesome. Last words? Are you going to kill me? Jeez. No,
I know you've already given so many.
Thank you for having me, I guess. This was awesome. Forgive me for my very rough put together thing.
It was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye, everyone.